So good afternoon, or very early in the morning, and maybe various time zones in between to everybody. My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Ethics Center here at UNC Charlotte, and I'm pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Seye Abimbola of the University of Sydney to have a sort of talk and then hopefully much broader conversation about a statement he and some co-authors released earlier this year about parachute research and the harms that that does to people in non-Western countries and with non-Western funding. So I think rather than talk about Seye's paper, I should just hand the floor over to him. So all yours.
Thank you very much, Gordon, and thanks, Lisa, as well. And thanks, everyone, for joining and for having me. So as everyone who was involved in this project will sort of give a narrative of its history differently, but from where I stand, it began, I think, with a struggle that I had with my role as an editor of a global health journal, and recognizing on the one hand that there was a problem about inclusion in terms of authorship, which has been talked about a lot, and which the journal that I edit has also sort of created a platform to publish research papers analyzing bibliometrics and authorship distribution patterns about. And there's a part of that that is just, in a sense, simpler, which is, diversify authorship on each paper. I think that's the simplest part of the problem, as I see it. There's a deeper problem about what we do itself. There was the content of the research itself, and how we position research, and how we position the audience of research, and whom it is for, and whose knowledge it centers, recognizes, privileges, takes as its starting point. So there's a whole series of problems that are far more difficult to solve than the authorship problem. And whenever I talk about this in this way, I mean, people who think a lot about authorship problem think it's difficult to solve, but in the grand scheme of things, it's the easiest is the easiest part of the problem. And I had done an editorial accompanying a series of papers highlighting the representation problem. And as I was writing the editorial, it occurred to me that even as a journal editor, my powers, and I know my powers are exaggerated in the minds of researchers, but they are really quite limited about how to go about changing any of those things. And in the editorial that I wrote to accompany the particular series of papers in 2019, I had proposed that perhaps what we should normalize is that authors include a statement in their paper, sort of declaring their positionality, as it were, in relation to the paper, their choice of journal, their choice of authorship, and by choice of journal, also by their choice of audience, whom they are writing for, and sort of explain that and make it a normal thing that authors have to think carefully about that. And when I discussed this with my friends who are researchers at the University of Sydney, a constant sort of response was, but we don't think about things like this normally. That this job, we take this as given, we just do our research and we publish it. But that's, we don't think about, who am I writing for, whom am I writing as. Right? Anyway, so that editorial came out in 2019, and another journal's editors, this journal being Anesthesia, a very clinical journal, we're also having problems with papers coming from research done in low and middle income countries that had no authors from those countries. And I think for them, they will be at the point of accepting the paper, and then they'll notice that there's something wrong with the authorship, and then it becomes a deep ethical problem for the authors to know what to do at that stage. And so they started to consult about what to do in-house about it. And then they spoke to someone who knows me, and then the person spoke to me, and then we sort of joined together and we started to think together about how to do something a bit more formal that other journals could adopt. Now, what is slightly different in the journal that I edit is that one of the screening criteria for taking a paper to peer review at all is a certain representation on the authorship, if it's a primary data collection study. In other words, if it's all American authors on a study done in Malawi, it has to be under extraordinary circumstances that we would even consider taking it to peer review in the first place. We would have to ask the authors, can you explain what has happened here, that there's no single human from Malawi on your authorship list? And but other journals sort of have different ways of going about the screening papers. So this journal had this challenge and then came together, and then they spoke to other journal editors across mostly sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Africa, sort of South Africa, Malawi, Tanzania. And then researchers have also been involved on the other side of sort of governing partnerships, whether as department chairs or as ethics committee chairs or as partnership coordinators, different roles in research partnerships, again, in Africa. And we came together and had, I think, 5 sessions, just trying to think through what it might look like to have a structured format for a kind of reflexivity statement. In other words, we were also really mindful of the fact that there was only so much, again, that the journal can do within the broader research ecosystem. We're just a tiny part, a consequential part, nonetheless, but a small part. And often things get to us at the very end of the life of a study. So we can only influence things in retrospect, as it were. But the way we thought about the idea of a statement is that it would serve the important function of changing the narrative. That if we could all agree to a kind of statement that authors will have to submit when they're submitting papers from a partnership, then the hope is that 2, 3, 4 years down the line, after an author must have had to do that for a study that's already completed, when they are starting a new study, they are more likely to begin to think about it at the beginning. So we also recognize that even as an intervention, its pathway to impact is not direct in that sense. It's going to take several iterations, even within a research team, to get to a point where it becomes the norm that they're thinking about it. Because really what we want to change is the norm, not so much whose name is on the paper at the end of the day. It's how you think about what a paper is, what a study is, what a partnership is or should be like. And different people came to that group with different, I think, primary agenda in their mind. There were people on the team who, what they want to talk about is not so much authorship as what they called initially legacy, which is the idea that what does a study leave behind? And these were sort of people who were managing partnerships in Tanzania and in Malawi. That authorship is one thing. Another thing is, how do you think about the legacy that your partnership or your collaboration leaves in the country? And there were people who were thinking more about women's representation. Again, the studies analyzing authorship patterns show very clearly that the least represented group are women in lower middle income countries. The least, it's always consistently the lowest. And so there are people who came to that group as well with that top of mind. There are people who were there with early career researchers as top of mind. So different people sort of came to the same sort of set of issues from different angles, and also allowed us to then have a, suppose, more comprehensive set of things to include in the reflexivity statement structure. And there were those, I shouldn't forget, there were those who came to the group with safeguarding as their primary concern ahead of anything else. So it's quite a comprehensive list of 15 questions. I came to the group with my primary concern was where did your research question come from? Which is what I'm most interested in. Again, as an editor, I sort of read a manuscript. I'm thinking to myself, who decided that this was something worthwhile in this particular space at this particular time? So anyway, so there's this list of 15 questions that we came up with at the end of the day, published in the journal Anesthesia. And accompanying that list was 6 recommendations. Now, again, another person talking to you about this will begin with the 6 recommendations and sort of talk about the 15 as secondary. But for me, the list of 15 questions are primary. The 6 recommendations are slightly less important to me. But the 6 recommendations were essentially for journals to recognize their power, however limited, and to use it. Another is to open up the space of the number of potential authors on a paper. There are journals who still say you can't have more than 2 or 5 or 10, just open it up. And then there's another one that was about, allow for sort of joint first authorship, joint last authorship. And I've seen recently joint second authorship, which in itself is an interesting thing to think about. And there was also another recommendation about the reflexivity statement itself. And there was another about ensuring that research done in low and middle income countries are open access, just generally open access. And the last recommendation was something around these recommendations should speak to actors beyond just journals and journal editors, that the research institutions, individual researchers, funders should also adopt these recommendations, which I think is very important, was a very important part of the list of 6 recommendations, because again, there's only so much a single actor could do within the ecosystem. It needs to percolate, the norm needs to spread to other actors. And then to accompany that statement, the consensus statement that we published, I also then co-wrote an editorial in BMJ Global Health journal that I edit, along with a researcher and friend from Ghana, but currently working in Nigeria, Nadia Sam Agudu. And what we decided to do there was to go back and examine the criteria for authorship from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, because that's broadly accepted and used in public health and in medicine. And to look at, within each criteria, the spaces for inclusion. And the reason is that a lot of the counter arguments that we anticipated about this consensus statement was the allegation or the charge or the argument that this will just encourage ghost authorship. People who haven't contributed will now, their names will now be put on paper. So we really were thinking about that. I was thinking about that all through this process. And I wanted to lay it out a bit clearly that doesn't have to be the case. In fact, what has been the problem really is that these criteria have been used to exclude strategically rather than include. The criteria themselves are very, very open to inclusion. And they hadn't, until that editorial, at least to my knowledge, they hadn't been talked about that way as things that are actually by their structure inclusive. And they are inclusive. So what we did in that editorial was to lay out how under each criteria, in fact, the ICMJE criteria have a lot of space for inclusion. That you have to really want to exclude people to exclude them. It's not, people don't get excluded by default, you choose to exclude people. And that was the structure of the criteria. And I'll just go through them briefly. So the first one is about, so there are four criteria, and it's and between each of them. In other words, a person has to fulfill all 4 criteria. But within each of the criteria, the first 2, there are several ors. In other words, there are many ways in which you can fulfill criteria 1 and criteria 2, because they have lots of ors. Be involved in conceiving the study, collecting data, analyzing data, etc. So lots of things that one can be involved in under 1. Under 2, it's been involved in drafting or revising the draft. Again, you have to choose not to invite a person, or not to be patient enough with a person, or not to do it in a format that they can be involved in drafting and revising. And then the third is approving the final version. Again, that is the easiest thing to do. And then the fourth is being willing to answer to any question if it were to arise in the future about the integrity of the work. So four criteria, by their definition and structure, really open if you just choose to use it that way. So that was what we did with that editorial, and in a sense to encourage people to use it that way. Yeah, so I suppose I'll stop there. But yeah, so that's the work, that's the nature of the work, and that's the sort of thinking that went into it.
Great, thank you. And so Lisa Rasmussen is my colleague who actually specializes in research ethics. And so I'd like to invite her to take over some discussion now.
And I'm going to also invite everyone else, please, to either post a question in the chat box or raise your hand or wave furiously so that we can see you. I know there are, and just for transparency's sake, let me tell you, Seye, that I have several students here from my graduate seminar in research ethics that we just conducted this afternoon, and we read your paper in preparation for that. And we also read a few other papers that are doing similar work in this space. So that's some of the stuff that I wanted to ask you about. So let me start with asking you if you could to talk about you define the research ecosystem differently in the consensus paper than typical people did. And I think it helps to do this work to be able to think about that research ecosystem. And Gordon linked to the paper. So there's actually a figure in the paper that people can refer to. But if you could just say how you came about that differently, or how you came at it differently, and what work that enabled you to do.
Yeah, so something I didn't mention in my sort of opening description was that there were different groups of people who handled different parts of the document. And there was a group that was tasked with trying to figure out how we might go about defining what the research ecosystem is, especially in a field like ours that sort of spans countries and jurisdictions. And one of the reports we had from that group was that there wasn't a sufficiently satisfying definition available that would sort of serve our needs. So they had to come up with a definition, but then also try and represent it. You notice in the paper there is a kind of diagram, has too many angles, but there's that diagram that sort of try to represent what it looked like. And what they were trying to do, if I remember correctly, and I'm opening it on my phone now, what they were trying to do is have a way to sort of map out the relations between high-income country actors and low- and middle-income country actors, and what the role of journals might look like in the middle of that, recognizing the power of sort of big funders and big global health agencies, but also understanding that there ought to be a role for local communities and policy context within LMICs in the research ecosystem, which is often silent. And also sort of describe what the power relations look like between those actors and the flow of knowledge, and how that works.
This is David, I see your hand. I'll come back to you in just a second. But one of the things I really appreciated about it was that they noted at the beginning, and when they started talking about it, that when you focus only on the inputs and the elements, you miss all the systems and the relationships and the structures and the power and the capital, as was discussed. And so I thought we would start there, just because it helps, I think, broaden the conversation to even talk about these things in the first place. David, go ahead, please.
So thank you for your talk. I have a couple of questions. First of all, would this proposal apply to research where there's been no interaction with the developing country? Suppose that data from this country were available in an international database, and someone reanalyzed the data from the country. Would they have to include somebody from that developing country on that paper? or because there was no interaction, even though the paper is about that country, all they're doing is reanalyzing existing data.
Should I answer right away?
Yeah.
Yeah. So while the motivation for this work was around primary data and the need for representation, one of the things that we're also very careful about is not so much to insist on representation as much as to invite people to explain why there was not such representation. Now, I can imagine scenarios in which you could analyze secondary data and deliberately choose to actually include and engage with people in the country who might have different interpretations, perspectives, background knowledge to the person analyzing the secondary data. To not do so, again, I like to say it's a choice. And it's a choice that is worth explaining. And again, I don't think anyone should put, knife to anyone's neck for not doing something, but one should have a good reason for the choices one makes. And I suppose that's what we're trying to get at here, that people should be able to explain why they did what they did in the way they did it.
Okay. The second issue is, do you think that this would encourage honorary authorship, just people being named on papers so that you could say that you included somebody from the developing country on your paper?
Yes, there's that risk, but we all do things, even though we know that there are risks that it could go wrong. So there's that risk. What I should also mention is that without these recommendations, that is going on anyway, a lot. And there are studies to that effect. It's a lot. And what happens, in fact, is that the people who tend to be included in this way are very powerful people. And that is the status quo, as it were. And I'm willing to take a risk of including people who are not so powerful. As today, I may change my mind on that in 5 years. But today, I'm willing to take the risk that we include people who are not so powerful that way.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Heather, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Asheville. Thanks for letting outsiders join. Brief introduction, I work at the Social Science Research Council and also just had a paper, thank you, Seye, accepted it at BMJ Global Health. So 2 questions. One is, this is framed as a global health problem, but Seye, I know you also work in Australia, and you work with, I think some Indigenous health issues. Do you feel like it's already sort of solved within countries across hierarchy and vulnerability lines in terms of these things? Or is global health just sort of the starting point, and then you might also start looking within countries? So that's one. And then 2, I think it'd be really great, as someone who just went through it, to talk a little bit about what the hoped for process by which teams would write this appendix, as opposed to what might happen, which is you ask just one person to do it. So it'd be really cool just to, in your ideal world, what would that process look like?
So on the in-country part of the puzzle, in fact, the last sentence of the editorial that I wrote with Nadia was that there has to be a version of this kind of reflexivity statement for in-country research, or that at least it should think of itself as speaking to that. I know, for example, that in Australia, Indigenous people have an entire structure to govern partnerships with them, which includes, for example, sending your finished manuscript to an Indigenous committee to have a look at before it goes out. So it's that strict. So there are, I'm sure it's not peculiar to Indigenous Australians. I can bet that there are other places in the world with similar rules governing research engagement with them. And I'm currently trying to do some kind of scoping of what that landscape might look like, and what sort of governing mechanisms are in different places. There are also, of course, in LMICs themselves, many different kinds of power dynamics within countries, men, women especially, but also senior, junior. also caste in a place like India. So there are all these kinds of dynamics everywhere. And, again, a tiny little journal that it's oversized in its own imagination somewhere in the global north cannot possibly do much about all of this, but at least demonstrate some kind of example of how it might be done, and provide that sort of template and excuse and argument for others who might want to do something similar in different spaces. In terms of hope for process, the way it plays out in my mind, and again, I can't speak for others who are involved in this exercise, but the way it plays out in my mind is that we will sort of in 2 or 3 years do a kind of retrospective, sort of collect statements that have been published and analyze them from 2 angles. One, to know how to better ask the questions, what other questions to ask, but also to get a sense of how people are approaching answering the questions. And then to also see what strategies people have put in place for inclusion in their work that could then sort of become recommended practices, or look at what these people did, look at what these other people did kind of way. And again, the way I think about this is that we're trying to change norms primarily. We're trying to really, really shift how people, the ground assumptions about what research is or should look like. And you can't, and for that reason, you can't allow too much quietness in between interventions. In other words, I do have this belief that you have to say something about this. Someone has to do something about this sort of pretty much every 4 months. Keep it alive in the minds of people and normalize it in that way.
Yeah, I mean, if I can speak for one more minute, I agree. I mean, I almost wish, I know this is new, but like that there was, that it was almost like at the pre-analysis plan stage for studies that have a pre-analysis plan. I feel the same way about the, the Carlin et al. Structured ethics appendix, that I think it would do a lot of good at that point. Just on a minute on our process that I saw a question came through. Yeah, I don't think we did it the ideal way at first. I mean, I think the Ugandan co-author took a first stab and mostly wrote it just about himself. And then I spent a long time also really doing elevation of our junior colleagues who were both Kenyan, German, and otherwise, and invited them to comment and bring in their experience. So it was very interesting, and it felt like probably not the right process, which you heard a little bit about for sure. But I mean, I can imagine like, ideal would have been like everyone getting in a room and having a real chat about it, and reflecting on what we wish we had done differently and also sharing that out. In the end, I think we got there with everybody commenting on it. But even, this guy who's a professor, I was like, don't you want to mention like anything about your grad student? He's like, nope. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I'm going to write something in about her, and I don't really know her. Anyway, so, some of those things might just get reproduced in how the appendix itself is populated, and especially when it's populated late. I think when it's like the last thing you're doing for a submission, that everyone just wants it done as opposed to something thoughtful that you've been updating all along, like you suggested.
And Dr. Hosseini, I see your hand up, but I also saw Dr. Lambrinidu's comment or question in the chat. And so since it's related to what Dr. Lantham was talking about, I just wanted, I don't know, Yana, if you want to unmute yourself or if I should read it for you, if you're not in a position to do that. But
yeah, sure. Happy to. Hi. Thank you so much for making this an open talk. And this is really fantastic. Really an honor to be here. So my question is that I'm very excited to learn about this reflexivity statement initiative. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think that it can help change research norms if we continue to give control over reflexivity practices to authors themselves? And even though, it seems very promising when journals set expectations that local authors are included, and certainly it's promising when journals are open access, because certainly that brings transparency and potentially accountability. I fear that parachute researchers who engage with communities in harmful ways would still be able to write impressive reflexivity statements that actually mask even significant protest on the ground. And so what I'm wondering about is, do you think that reflexivity statements are vulnerable to, in some cases, functioning as an additional layer of cover for unethical work? And if so, do you have ideas about how we can protect against such use of reflexivity statements, which seem like a potentially very important accountability and justice measure?
Great, thank you. And I follow Yana and Heather on Twitter, and I'm a huge fan of both of them on Twitter. So it's nice to especially talk to Yana for the first time. I know Heather a bit well. So here's the thought that came to mind as you were asking your question. The BMJ, the parent BMJ journal, has an in-house investigative sort of journalism unit. It's never done investigative journalism on sort of global health research partnerships. I think it should. I'm encouraging it too. But one of the things that I've been concerned about is that kind of work in an ideal kind of research ecosystem will be something that many departments of public health and clinical epidemiology and global health ask people who do as their work. It's like, what economists often call and psychologists call the reproducibility problem, and how sort of some people just spend a lot of their time trying to reanalyze existing data. And I'm thinking about that in this way, especially because I know that there are, as Yana said, that there are many ways to make deeply unethical, unjust work sound perfect on paper. And I think that there should be researchers whose work it is to ferret those ones out and write about them and talk about them in the open. And this line of thinking is sort of close to mind because we have one such paper coming out in the journal soon, where a group of authors in South Africa have written a commentary about a study that is currently ongoing in 2 African countries, funded by a big foundation. You can guess which one it is. That is unethical and unjust, just going by what they've published in their protocol. Right. So again, for me, when I think about accountability, I don't think very much that the reflexivity statement can do more than sort of self-accountability, in a sense that, okay, I'm telling you this is what I do, well, this is what I've committed myself to and I've tried to do. But it's not much greater than that. But the hope is that it can spread and normalize things. But in terms of real proper accountability for these kinds of work, I do believe very strongly that what we have to do, and I've done that a couple of times with other people's papers, sort of just writing a long piece of article about why such studies shouldn't have been conducted in the first place. And I think more of that should be done in global health. And this particular paper that I said is coming out had to go to legal review at the BMJ yesterday, and came out today, and legal says you can publish it. So we are going to publish it. But that's the kind of thing. And we had another one years ago that went to legal, and legal says you can't publish it. But thankfully, it was already published for a few minutes, so it's available online. But these are the kinds of ways in which I think about accountability for equity and justice. We can't, reflexivity statement can't solve the problem. We have to have a proper mechanism for doing that. I often think about the broadly define the evidence-based medicine movement, and think about what their strategies were to, in a sense, entrench their preferred practices. And one of the things they did, not in a very coordinated way, but one of the things they did was to periodically, someone would publish articles reviewing the practices of previous studies, sort of just saying which studies reported this, which studies did not report that, which studies did this, which did not do that, which journals mandated this, which ones did not do that. I also think that's the kind of thing, that's something that we could do in international research partnership studies, that people will periodically sort of sit down and collect examples of practices and just write about them. Just so that people are aware that they are being watched, because there is no other way than having some kind of mechanism like that. And also, of course, having the opportunity for communities, for researchers, for people on the ground to also publish these kinds of commentaries. What I'm most happy about with the commentary that I said is coming out is that it's researchers on the ground who know people around where the studies are being conducted who decided to write this. And I hope, you know, more groups like that will speak up when these kinds of studies are going on.
Toby, I see you, but I just wanted to check. Mohammed, did you still have a question?
Yes, thanks for checking. Thanks so much. This is really interesting and I find it quite progressive. So I have two quick questions. The first one is about, you know, I just read this for the first time, and one of the things I noticed in the article is that you propose that the statement will be reviewed during the editorial process to inform decisions on manuscript acceptance. Do you think this is something that should be reviewed by, for instance, peer reviewers or editors? And if that is the case, how should they be informed / educated about assessing this? Because this is a completely different kettle of fish. Like, it's not about rigor or, you know, the scientific validity of what is being presented. And I think like diversity in different fields could be different things. I understand that the context is parachute research, but I think just being able to assess these statements is in and of itself, like, it requires a different skill set. That's why we have like diversity, equity, equality offices in universities, because these are things that, you know, require expertise. So this is one question I have. The other one is that if it is the case that the acceptance of manuscripts would be dependent on, for instance, their diversity, inclusiveness statement, and this would be like strictly enforced. Now, enforcement aside, let's suppose that this will be enforced. Don't you think that this would have a negative effect on collaborations between researchers affiliated to high-income countries with those who are affiliated with low-income countries?
I'm not sure I understood the second question.
The second question is about, if it is enforced strictly, don't you think that it would have a negative effect on collaborations between researchers that are affiliated with low-income countries and those that are affiliated with high-income countries? So if
Can you give an example of?
So if, let's suppose I'm a researcher who's affiliated with a Scandinavian university, like I'm privileged, and I have access to all different types of resources. If I know that I have to disclose every single decision I made about my research, I might be less likely to do research with someone who's affiliated with a low-income country.
Okay, good. So I'll go to the first and come to the second. The second is way easier to answer. So the first question, which is about rigor and validity. So about 2 or 3 years before this reflexivity statement came out, I had started to notice a trend in which reviewers, because we try to assign reviewers who are based in or from or close to where the study is conducted. So we take contextual knowledge and contextual misrepresentation seriously within papers. So we try to send papers to people who know the setting. And very often they would remark, often privately to the editor, just how they know that these people don't know what they're talking about in A, B, C, D, E ways. And this happens quite often, by the way. So it's hard in the kind of work that we do to separate what you've called validity and rigor from contextual knowledge. I don't know how to do that. Because very often, in fact, the way a question is framed itself can suggest a lack of understanding of what is really going on in a space. And reviewers pick this up. And I suspect also because reviewers also know what the journal perhaps wants or is like, they're perhaps a bit more likely to think about this. So there's a way in which we can't decontextualize what knowledge is being produced. And so reviewers are doing this anyway. In many cases, we expect that the reviewers can see the reflexivity statement. There's a guide in the consensus statement about how reviewers might think about the reflexivity statement, which is, think about whether the authors engaged with it, whether, the research was co-developed in a way that sort of shows real partnership, what the authorship looked like, what dissemination plans look like. But in all of those, there's no prescription as to whether, if there's no local author, reject. It's still a recommendation to the editor. In other words, a reviewer doesn't make a final decision. It's still, guys, do this, don't do that. And we often disagree. So it's not sort of black and white in that way. And often the decision gets made on the basis of whether the authors really know what they're doing. Now, as an editor of a journal that has way too many submissions than we can handle, so every week I sort of reject without peer review about 100 manuscripts. So that's a huge number. So when making decisions about those papers as well, I have to stand back and ask myself, on what basis am I going to decide which ones to take to peer review? And one of the criteria that I set for myself is that I want a study that can have impact in the setting where it was conducted, or that shows a certain level of potential for the knowledge to feed back into decision making. And again, when you think about what the characteristics of those kinds of studies might look like, you would expect that a certain degree of that decision is made based on how locally engaged the study is. So there are those shades of decision making that are not just black and white, and that they are sort of thinking that go into how an editor makes decisions. That it's not just, I don't think we are not asking for people to include people by force. And I get, people have been criticized, for example, on Twitter for publishing papers in the journal that had no local authors. So it's not as though it's a black and white complete yes or no. But if a paper if I have reason to think that this study is consequential, will be consequential in the space where it was conducted, then it's worth taking through peer review. So it's not black and white in that way. Now, about what it might do to a potential high-income country partner, there's this lovely, it makes me smile when I think about it. There's this lovely talk by Chimamanda Adichie, sort of the Nigerian novelist, who I think she was talking about feminism or something like that, and she said something about how, I think she was being asked, or she'd been asked a lot about men who are sort of afraid of her or sort of are intimidated by her, and she said that it's those kind of men that I don't want to have anything to do with. And I would apply the same thing here. If you are afraid that by declaring something you are making yourself vulnerable, then I really wish that you are not involved in these kinds of partnerships at all.
I unmuted myself to quietly clap. I don't know what I was thinking. Sarah, you have a question.
We can't hear you, Sarah.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, my name is Sarah Lucas. I am not an academic or a researcher, so I'm sorry to be interloping. I learned about this talk through Ruth Levine Shea, who you are serving on the board of ID Insight, which is an organization I just joined. But I spent 8 years at the Hewlett Foundation funding research and think tanks globally, particularly organizations in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia, to do policy research and influence policy. So I know that think tanking and academic research are different categories, But it's such a striking observation how kind of what different state of play is in this kind of dialogue among the think tank community and the kind of global policy community, global development policy community, in which it is like no longer accepted to write about a country without having country authors. It's no longer accepted to host a research conference about a region without having it primarily populated by scholars from that region. It's no longer accepted to do research collaborations and have, you know, the global South scholars being your enumerators, but not really setting the agenda on the policy research or influencing the budget for the policy research. So that world just seems to be in a very different state of play on this topic than the academic world is. And I'm just curious about why that is.
From the little I know, I saw Udo, from his name, sort of do something that suggests money, and power and prestige. You know, there is. So when you talk about the academic world, I think I want to separate that into categories, right? There are sort of people in public health and global health, which is a field that has gotten used to having lots of authors on a paper. Partly because of the ICMJ criteria, but also for other sort of social reasons. It's more women, more people who are sort of open to these kinds of things, are far more open to this than a field, say, like development economics, where, you know, you're expected to have 1 or 2 papers, and you have this difficult tenure system and hyper top 5 journal. There's a whole ecosystem that sort of stops you from doing anything like this in a field like economics, which is much less so in public health and global health. In fact, my sense is that as far as this kind of reflexivity statement is concerned, we're not so far from regular practice in a lot of global health spaces. But we are far from regular practice in a lot of development work and international relations, international development work, which is, I think, partly because of how white and elite those fields tend to be relative to public health and global health, which is slightly less so, not very much, but slightly less so. Yeah, that's perhaps the only explanation I have. There's the other one, of course, about the more your career depends on authorship and sort of prestige, individual prestige, the less you are likely to be open to involving, engaging, treating other people as equals and with respect. So there's a whole lot of that dynamic as well. But
Toby, please.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I wanted to go back for a minute to some of the questions that Mohammed asked about sort of the role of the editors and peer reviewers. I was thinking about it from that perspective. You know, you had talked about that when you have someone from InCountry review a piece, that they often say to you, these folks have no idea what they're talking about. The opposite can also be true, which is what I'm thinking, that this statement might actually have instrumental value in addition to its intrinsic value, which is for those of us who are editors or even peer reviewers who are reviewing material from countries or just areas with which we are not the most familiar, right? So you can read with the principle of charity and at the same time really want to know, is this useful? So there can be we've had this in our journal a couple of times. There's a question that in the US is long settled. Like, why are people writing about this? And a statement like the one that you are describing that really gives the robust inclusion of people who are thinking about this issue and why it is important for them could help us as editors say, wait, this could really have an impact. And so it can help not just for the inclusion piece and the justice piece, but also in some ways for the fairness piece, that we don't dismiss questions or concerns that in some contexts are no longer up for debate, but actually move an issue forward. And I don't love instrumental only justifications, but for folks who are thinking about the concern, I mean, there may be a slight analogy to requiring research ethics review of clinical trials, right? So in theory, it's not because you have the piece of paper, but it's because you've had some sort of rigorous ethics oversight. Now, we can long debate whether or not that happens, but the idea is to change practice to get people to really say these things are important in my research. I think this could potentially have that instrumental value as well. So more a comment than a question.
Yeah, completely agree. And it's the one of the things that bothers me is the unthinkingness of a lot of what we do. So just this idea that we just do things based on some settings that have been handed down to us. And one of what I personally and many others who are involved in this wish would happen is that we just think more carefully through every stage. Because if we think, again, principle of charity, I believe if people think about these things, practice will be very different. Just, people would behave differently if they were to think about. And an example I often give is that there is the normal practice is to approach a question in a particular space, say a district in Ghana, approach a study there as though our primary audience is this vaguely defined global north-based academics, journals. When you approach a study in a district in Ghana that way, you do it differently to if you assume that your primary audience are people in that district in Ghana. When you are talking to people in Ghana, you are more likely to want to take their existing knowledge seriously, their existing practices and learning seriously, and to contribute to their ongoing process of learning. And then, whatever the global north person or someone in Nigeria or someone in the UK takes from that will be secondary. The primary, and that's how I often think about research now, that the primary audience should be the people there. Because when they are the people there, as a Malian literary theorist, Diawara, once said that every narration puts the spectator in a position of agency. It's whom you are talking to. It changes what you are saying by virtue of that. And I think we've defaulted, in a sense, to speaking to Europe and North America. And when we are speaking to them, you've given them agency, and that changes what you say and how you say it and how you do it.
I think in addition, well, maybe this is an instrumental point, but Toby, to kind of go along with what you were saying, that another instrumental point is we get better information when we let people who understand the question better and or differently ask it or play an equal role in asking it. Yeah, Gordon.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not a scientist or a researcher, but I do quite a bit of work on data and data ethics. And I wanted to return to that for just a minute because, this is a global problem, I suppose. But as low and middle income countries develop their capacity to work with data and develop the sort of computing infrastructure and so forth, there are huge problems with data collected on populations, which may or may not have even properly consented it to it. And this has already happened, and this is rampant in the global north. And so I'm wondering if there's any way to sort of think about this problem and try to head it off a little bit before it gets started, because we, by which I mean the global north, have completely failed to protect data subjects in any meaningful way.
I don't know how to answer that or even think about that. I know that I'm speaking to ethicists, and I know ethicists have been thinking a lot about what informed consent means and at what level to get consent and how to even go about thinking about that. There's also, I mean, different things are coursing through my mind as I'm thinking about your question. There is the problem that researchers are not trained to see the full humanity of quote unquote research subjects or people giving data. I think that there is something to be said about training. In other words, from grad school, how you think about what research is and how whom you are researching on. There is something else that came to mind as you were asking your question, which was a scenario that played out in Kenya. I think it was early 2020, when the story broke. I think CNN broke a story about how a new kind of whale migration had been discovered. And then it turns out that that new whale migration that was supposed to have been discovered had been known to local communities and fishermen in Kenya forever. In fact, they told this woman who claimed to have discovered it. And then they sort of came out and spoke out and said, well, she didn't discover it. We've known this forever. And it just made me think also about the ethics of authorship, or the ethics of claims to knowledge. That who decides whether that thing needs to be discovered? In other words, who didn't know that needed to know? Because again, when you talk about discovering something, it's a group of people who didn't know and who now know.
Yeah, I feel like that's also not always innocent, right? So the Rice Tech Corporation brought a bag of basmati rice in from India in like 2010 or so, and then attempted to patent it. And it took a lot of money spent by the Indian government to get this patent defeated, because of course, no one had published what basmati rice is in a journal or a place that was legible to the US Patent Office. And so yeah, I think biopiracy is, you're right, also a part of this question.
Paula, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this discussion, and the opening remarks say it's just fascinating. My name is Paula. I'm an ethicist and a white settler living and working on Turtle Island, or also known as Canada, which was home first to the First Nations, Innu, Métis, and Indigenous peoples. So, and I want to just acknowledge the land that I work on first. So my question is about the reflexivity statement. When you're done, or when you start and you include, one of the things that I've seen as an ethicist, and most recently in the development of triage guidelines in Canada, for physicians to use when they're surgeon in a pandemic. So to decide, who gets what health resource and who does not. And I stepped away from the publication for different reasons and various reasons. But in the process of developing it, there was consultation with Indigenous, Black, disability, human rights scholars, but nothing in the published document reflects those consultations. And I'm wondering about the accountabilities of consulting these groups as if that was sufficient. And if you didn't know what they said, you wouldn't know they weren't aligned, and it's not said anywhere. And what are the accountabilities when you hear disagreement, where you hear different perspectives, different worldviews, different kinds of knowledge, and And who is accountable to that? Is it the editor? Is it the authors? They said we did this. I stepped away because of the process didn't have enough integrity. It was problematic, but yet here we see this published document now for the whole world to see. And there's a reference to, groups of people, and we're left with the impression that there's agreement. So just would welcome your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. In fact, I had an interesting experience that's quite similar to the one you just described. Recently, there was a submission to the journal about decolonization, but from an American perspective. And I hadn't assessed the manuscript based on its authorship necessarily, but just its flatness, and it was rejected soon after it was submitted. And then a week or so later, I had an email from an indigenous group in the US saying that they were consulted. Their insights were not included in the paper, and they were not even included as authors in the paper. Thankfully, I had rejected this paper because it would have been difficult for me to make a decision after such an email. But I then sort of reassured the authors that I had already decided to reject this. But I agree with you that we have to have a way of thinking about what this means ethically. Something I've often wanted to tweet but never tweeted is just how surprised I am about the ethical free space that editors operate in. In other words, how limited ethical reflection is there and guidance is there for how editors do what they do. Like I've been shocked by it because almost every decision I have to make is an ethical decision. Almost every decision. And so I've been surprised by that. And again, it's partly because journals have had this power over time and been left on their own because they operate in a space where they have relative power, lots of power relative to those they work with. And it's one of the things I'm wishing to do, if I have a lot of time and energy ahead of me, to open that space up to the kind of ethical inquiry and reflection that the example you gave, Paula, suggests.
Udo, and let me ask quickly, Gordon, we go till 5:15?
It's fairly unstructured, 5:15, 5:30. It depends on when things tend to sort of settle down on their own in my experience. So I try not to be precise about end times.
Okay. And for Seye, eventually the rest of your continent will wake up and go along with you for the day. So we might need to let you
right.
go.
We
have time for more. So Udo, please.
Yes, so good morning to you in Australia, and thanks for getting up in the middle of the night. So I want to push back a little bit, if that's okay. After an hour of listening and how wonderful all these ideas are, there were a couple of critical questions that I agreed with. I should tell you probably, I have been an editor of one of our larger journals in bioethics, which surprisingly is called Bioethics. It's a Wiley journal. I have started about 22 years ago, to be precise, while I worked in South Africa for 5 years because I had nothing more than people parachuting into the global south. So I worked there for 5 years, actually. And we set up a journal called Developing World Bioethics. And the objective of that journal was precisely to set up an outlet for authors from the global south that probably would not be able to score a publication in the flagship journals. So as you can see, the journal is around 22 years later, so that actually worked. And it has the same distribution as the mothership, as I call it, Bioethics, and it's a Wiley journal, right? And I'm mentioning this because I wanted to get, amongst other points, if you don't mind, but I wanted to look at your point 4, I think, or 5. So honestly, the issues that authors from the global south face at the moment is not open access, because the truth is the global for-profit publishers have all these open access schemes. Actually, the opposite is the case. Very soon they will be unable to publish because they can't afford these flipping APCs, right? So that is the issue. So this endless campaigning for open access actually comes to bite them, because they won't be able to afford any longer publishing. Now, if then you say they don't have to pay the APCs either, fine by me. But at the moment, at least, that is not in your thing there, right? It's all about open access, right? While to me, it's like we kind of managed to resolve this in a way, because people in Nigeria, in South Africa, depending on how wealthy these countries are, there's all these schemes already that allow access through university libraries, right? That's one thing. To me, just to be clear, right? The big thing is, it's not about authorship. I have to be honest with you. To me, the big thing is like, who holds the money bags? Who's funding this research? Who is giving folks in the global north basically funding to parachute into these places? And then, quite frankly, to cover their backs, find some local collaborator and adding them to a paper. I mean, that's a sideshow, right? The actual issue is that people in the global south really aren't able to dictate research agendas. That's the actual issue, right? They cannot compete with people in the United States running for NIH funding, because they have these big apparatuses in these universities that help them write these grants, right? Nobody in Malawi is a bad example, because the NIH is there in a big way already. But think about Nepal, for instance. Well, you try people there trying to get access to that kind of funding. It's next to impossible for them, right? So then you have somebody in the global north, of course, who will, write a project involving Nepalese people. So you then basically say, okay, make them first author or second author or third or whatever author, right? And then you want to increase the number of authors so that somehow they end up on the paper, right? To me, the actual problem is that there's two problems, right? The one problem is that those who deserve authorship are probably unlikely to get excluded from those papers. From the journals that I see, people go out of their way to make sure that they have the people that were on the team on the paper as authors. That might be different in global health, I wouldn't know, to be frank, but certainly in our field, that is not the challenge. The actual challenge to me is, and the actual ethical issue is, that the people in the global north define the project, the question, the content, and yes, you get your co-authorship. And if you live in China, you get shitloads of money from your institution because you got onto that paper, right? That's what's happening there. So to me, that is the big issue, and everything you suggest there to me is just like an extension of the Vancouver guidelines. There will be more boxes to tick, and trust me, the people that generate billions and billions of research funding and get money thrown at them from the NIH or the Wellcome Trust, they know how to tick those boxes because they do that for a living. So you just add boxes, and this is what I'm concerned about. That the elephant in the room is really the funding. And this is the thing that really bothers me most, because under 4, for instance, at the end of the day, all you do is just to encourage more complex lies by authors. Let's be honest. The Vancouver guidelines in the BMJ group, for instance, right? Some of your journals I've submitted there, right? But now you click boxes, okay, to say, I have ticked all the relevant Vancouver guideline boxes, right? It's a joke. It's a complete joke. So now you want a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, right? But then in the end, you still get nothing. My problem is, I wish these things would change, but I just think unless you change the funding structures, nothing is really going to change. Well, and the other thing is, I just want to mention this at least, right? And forget about global south, global north. In a different life, I lived in Europe. I live in Canada now. There, the European Commission decided to throw money at projects depending on whether people from certain countries were included. Forget about which countries, is unimportant. So politically, that meant people would be included on projects that actually contributed nothing. But we all knew them. It's fine. They flew to the meetings because they love traveling. And in brackets, that is certainly true for a lot of people in my field, in bioethics, research ethics, from the global south. I can name you these people. They've done this for the last 20 years. They travel nonstop. We all know them. Funny enough, it is very difficult for people from the global south to actually get onto this travel Rolodex, as I call it, the funding Rolodex, right? that's my problem. Nothing changes because everything is dictated by the people holding the money bags. There's old people like me, old white people, old white guys, all right? And a few older white women, but that's it basically. So nothing changes, and this is what frustrates me so much, right? Because the truth is we have these people on the Rolodexes from the Global South. They are on these papers now. Nothing has changed. I mean, they've done this for 20 years by now, right? So this is what I'm really struggling with. And the last thing I want to say, and this might not be true for you in global health, for us in bioethics, the actual problem is that the funding agencies have completely succeeded in preventing people in the Global South from actually focusing on things that actually matter in the Global South. We do research ethics, left, right, and center, and there's a reason for this. It's ideology transfer. The NIH needs it, and the Wellcome Trust need it. And so we train these people nonstop, and in return for that, they travel. And this is really how corrupt this whole thing is in our field, all right? And as you can tell, I'm not applying for funding, so I can say all these things. And so I leave it at that. I'm just very frustrated, and I appreciate the intention completely. I love it, but I'm just not sure that you have the finger on what actually the problem is, which is money.
I'll try and come at this from different angles, and where I disagree with you, I will be very gentle.
Don't beat me.
I think the first thing here to think about is the extent to which people are saying what you just said now openly in your field and banging on about it. Because nothing is going to change if you and other people are not saying this every day. That's what I've noticed in my field, that people have to be saying this, especially people who find themselves in positions of power and are at the center in one shape or form, journal editors, research chairs, just keep saying this. I'm much more hopeful than you about change. I think the more people say this, I think a lot about how norms change. And norms change when people proselytize about it actively. And when people make other people whom they are trying to change think that people like them are actually thinking about changing and are actually changing. In other words, you have to keep talking about this. And that is my way of saying I agree with most of what you've said, right? The part that I don't agree with is that tick box exercises don't change things. I know many people think that it's an easy thing to say because it sounds like it actually is true, but it's not. I know people who sit on grants panels and committees, and I've had a lot of feedback in the last 6-7 months about the changing dynamics of how even grant panels decide what to fund, which is different from what it used to be like 3 years ago. Again, because people are making noise every day. I believe very much in making noise every day. Because the people who are going to sit on those panels are people like you and me, who know that you and me care about these things. It affects them. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, I was quoting Mantu Diawara earlier, who says sort of every narration puts the spectator in a position of agency. My deep conviction is that there's no way that a BMJ Global Health, a Lancet, a bioethics, a developing world bioethics, in fact, even, will serve Nigeria or Ghana or India. They can't. They can't. Nigeria needs its own BMJ. Ghana needs its own Lancet. We fool ourselves if we think that journals in the Global North will do what they've done for Global North in the Global South. It's just the audience is different. And so the nature of those spaces are different. So I'm also keenly aware that even in all of this, we are talking about a tiny speck in the grand knowledge infrastructure or ecosystem of a particular country. All of this, all that we're talking about is very tiny. When I'm in Nigeria and I'm in policy spaces in Nigeria, nobody quotes BMJ Global Health or any study someone has done. Nobody quotes those things. People talk about real things in the country, in the space. Now, if we are going to be responsible, right, we will have to shift from our tiny little over exaggeratedly important global spaces and actually go and learn how people use knowledge. in different spaces for change and insert ourselves to facilitate those processes. Now, I can talk for 2 hours on this and get angry and then smile a little bit in the process. But I am keenly aware that the journal I edit is a very tiny little speck in anything, not least in a space like Nigeria or India or Ghana. So even when we think about NIH and authorship and all of those things, they're tiny. Now, when I think about the future, I'm thinking about a future in which those of us who play in this particular space that we're talking about begin to recognize our marginality and take it very seriously, and begin to recognize that different spaces have always used knowledge for change, and to stop, as you say, imposing all these expectations of how Europe works, of how all of those things. And when I think about long into the future and ask myself, how do we get there? Whatever I and my friends and colleagues are doing now are the tiniest of baby steps. The tiniest of baby steps to get there. But we have to take them. And I see this as a learning process. And for me, the big learning here is how do you, the question I'm asking myself, not just as an activist, but also as a scholar, I'm asking myself is, how do you get people in this space to change? Now, I'm not, holding brief that they're going to change, but I want to learn. What are the things about these kinds of action and expectations and statements and things lead to some kind of change? And I often anchor my optimism on how successful, I've mentioned this earlier, how successful the evidence-based medicine movement was at changing a little bit of space. It's a very tiny little change. But I look at them as an example that if they can move this field so much in 20 years, right? I hope global health, however defined, can move in 60, 70 years as much. So again, I'm not thinking, the change you're talking about, I'm not thinking that this change will happen in my lifetime. But I want to do as much as I can to plant seeds and to create the kind of discomfort and to make people feel that they can make the kind of noise that is necessary to make change happen.
And I know at least we have 2 editors. I edit a journal as well, and at least 2 self-declared funders so far. And so what you've started is echoing already. Jessa, we'll give you the last question.
I'm going to make it really quick to respect everyone's time. I'm Jessa. I'm not a researcher. I work in the field of air pollution. I have published one paper, which has been very interesting as a non-academic to see the process that happens when you publish a paper. I actually have a question going back to what Paula said. What is the recourse? I'm curious from your standpoint, what is her recourse when a journal has published a paper and she feels this way about it?
I think that there's something slightly unfortunate in that often a common recourse is to demand retraction. The problem with demanding retraction is that it takes a lot to get retraction. It takes a lot. It has to be so nakedly, black and whitedly egregious. It has to be very bad. So it's hard to get that. Now, when you sort of shift away from that outcome, the best you get is a complaint, an editorial, a commentary, a response, social media noise making, which I've been surprised at how effective it's been. Just social media noise making. Researchers tend to be very sensitive to it, so I'm happy when I see them sort of squirm at people making noise about their work. So it's hard. Recourse is hard, and again, it goes back to the idea of community, of space. That if you have a BMJ Global, a Lancet, or a big journal, it just doesn't occupy within a space that where there's a natural constituency around which people can feel a sense of accountability. Now, if BMJ was operating in the UK and you've done a study in the UK that is problematic, it's easy to hold you to account for that in the UK, right? If you've done something bad in Nigeria, it's harder, which again goes back to the earlier point that we have to begin to think more carefully about academic publishing in a jurisdictional sense. It just doesn't work to have this huge undefined circle of people, which is why Twitter works. Twitter makes you feel like you're in a small room. So you easily feel that sense of being looked at and being piled on. So it works in that little space, but not so many things can happen on Twitter. So in terms of recourse, what I often encourage when people complain is to write a commentary which will be published free of open access charges, which is a point Udo mentioned, which I didn't get to, free of open access charges. And we've been doing a lot of that, sort of just putting it out there and tweeting about it and getting people to be aware that at least someone is going to complain. But there isn't so much we can do.
Yeah, that's a pretty distressing thought for the general public that doesn't understand this process. You know, I think that's disturbing.
Yeah, we do have a view that there is a space for disagreement, and unfortunately it means you have to go through the whole publishing process and you have to have a certain format and it has to meet these authorship criteria, and it's much harder for people who are not already part of that ecosystem to engage in it and to have a voice that's paid attention to probably as well.
Yeah.
So since we're coming up on 5:26, I just wanted to note that in the chat, I added a couple of sites to papers because I think it's interesting that a lot of things have come out about the same time. Just in February, there was that Nature article that I put in the chat about Elsevier and other publishers working to track diversity in publications. And then the citation diversity statement that I put in was published, well, that was 2020. But there's work being done, and the more that these efforts get aligned, I think the more powerful they'll be. But I really have appreciated your time, Seye, and the paper that you wrote and the way you're approaching it. It's given us language to talk about. And I know we're having our editorial board meeting next week, and we're going to talk about adopting this for our journal. So I really appreciate your time. And if everyone would join me in thanking Seye. We've got our emoji. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you
everyone
so
for joining, and especially some of my students from class. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much.